I never thought I'd find myself in the situation I did that day in southwest Scotland. As an ornithologist, I'm used to spending long hours in remote places, immersed in the rhythm of the woods, focused on the calls of birds and the rustling of leaves. But there's something about being completely alone, surrounded by nature's vastness, that makes you notice the smallest things. Even the wind carries a different tone when you're out there, alone, without the distractions of civilization. That day, I was out on a bird survey, following a fence line that led up to the top of a hill. It was a part of the countryside I didn't know very well, deep in the heart of the forest, far away from any roads or towns. I had been walking for a good few hours, my boots crunching against the damp earth, the occasional call of a bird breaking the silence. The air smelled fresh, like damp moss and pine, and the light was soft, filtered through the thick canopy above me. The fence was old, weathered, and crooked, leading me through the dense forest toward the hill. It wasn't the easiest path to follow, but it was clear enough, and I figured I'd reach the top soon. The plan was simple: get to the top of the hill, set up my observation equipment, and do a quick survey of the area. Maybe take some photos of any interesting species I spotted along the way. But when I reached the top, something strange caught my eye. At the corner where the fence made a right angle, just at the very crest of the hill, I noticed something odd tied to the fence. Plastic bottle, nothing special at first glance. It was one of those cheap, translucent ones, the kind you see discarded on hiking trails. But this one was tied securely to the fence corner with a piece of string. Something about it felt out of place. It wasn't like any of the bottles I'd seen before. It wasn't weathered enough to blend in with the surroundings, and it wasn't discarded carelessly either. It had been deliberately placed there. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked over and untied the bottle, unsure of what I might find inside. I opened the cap slowly, not expecting much. Maybe a note from a hiker or some local trail information. But inside, there were a few pieces of rolled-up paper, secured with a crumbling elastic band. It didn't look like any geocache I had ever seen, but I assumed it might be some kind of record left by someone else who'd passed through this area. I unrolled the papers, and that's when the unease began to set in. The first note was just a few lines of words, written in a neat, almost deliberate hand. At first, I couldn't make sense of it, but as I read on, I realized it wasn't a simple note. It was a message, and it was very personal. The words were plain, but they felt heavy, like something was hidden behind them. Dear Sir or Hunter, hi, I'm Thomas, and here's my details, so as you will know me if you see me around here. Age, 40s, pale, 5 feet 7 inches, soft tender body, smooth skin, chest 35-inch, hips 37, bum cheeks 39. Please phone if interested in meeting or if you know any gent, that is. I have upper body and arm weakness and slightly weakling looks and no friend or relatives and closet lifestyle. I can meet here or Moore's/cafe or anywhere in UK, even on frosty mornings for a hunter. P.S. I'm inexperienced apart from some meetings with a gent in his garden shed in 1993, but I was always tied up, while he put something down my bladder and it got too painful. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had to reread them a couple of times to make sure I hadn't misinterpreted anything. But no, it was clear. The message was strange. It was intimate, yes, but more than that, it was unsettling. I looked around me, feeling my heart rate quicken, but the woods were still eerily quiet. Nothing but the faint breeze in the trees and the distant calls of birds. No sign of anyone nearby. I took a breath and tried to calm myself down. I was alone, yes, but I was also trained to be level-headed in unusual situations. There had to be some rational explanation for this. Maybe it was some weird prank or a bizarre, isolated incident. The note didn't say anything threatening, after all. It just seemed odd. I turned the paper over, thinking maybe there was something more. And that's when I found the second piece of paper. It was small, nearly torn at the edges, and it had a grainy black and white photocopy on it. The image was disturbing. It showed a man, bound at the wrists, hands tied above his head. His eyes were missing, cut out from the photograph. In the space where his eyes should have been, there was a tiny rectangular hole in the paper. Scrawled in rough handwriting were the words, too dark, and blindfold. My stomach twisted. I stared at the photo, trying to make sense of it. Why had someone left this here, in the middle of nowhere? Why had they tied it up with the note? I tried to shake the thoughts from my head. It had been here for a while, clearly. The bottle looked old. The paper crinkled and yellowed at the edges. Maybe it had been left years ago, long before I even started my job as an ornithologist. Maybe the person who wrote it was long gone, or perhaps this was some kind of abandoned message that had no relevance to me at all. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the creeping unease that settled over me. I was alone, completely alone. No one else for miles around. No other hikers, no signs of human life. The woods stretched out in every direction, silent and endless. And yet, here was this message, so out of place, so personal. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't know if it was fear or just the weight of the oddness of it all, but my instincts told me to leave. Fast. I carefully placed the note and the photo back inside the bottle, retying it with the same crumbling elastic band. I made sure everything was exactly as I had found it. I didn't want to disturb anything. As strange as it was, I didn't want to be the one to change anything. It didn't feel right. Maybe it was a mistake to open it in the first place, but I had done it. And now, all I wanted was to put as much distance between myself and that bottle as possible. I looked one last time at the fence corner, at the empty, silent expanse around me, and then turned around. I didn't even stop to take a picture or look at the view I had come here for. I simply retraced my steps, making my way back down the hill, through the thick forest, and towards the relative safety of the path. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my thoughts were racing. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a twig underfoot, felt amplified. The wind seemed to grow colder, the air thicker. The birds, which had been so vocal before, were now eerily silent. It was as if the entire forest had gone still, holding its breath. I didn't look back. I kept my head down, focusing on the ground ahead of me. Every step felt like it took forever, my legs heavy with the weight of the unease that had settled over me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the edge of the forest. The trees thinned out, and the open landscape stretched out before me. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, my heart still racing, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got back. Who would believe me, anyway? A strange note, a cryptic photo, a bottle tied to a fence in the middle of nowhere? It didn't seem real, and maybe it wasn't, but the feeling I had that day, the feeling of being watched, never really left me. I finished my bird survey, but I couldn't shake the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. That bottle, that note, they haunted me. I'd never find out who Thomas was, or what his strange message meant. But sometimes, when I'm out there in the woods, in the middle of nowhere, I can't help but wonder if someone, somewhere, is still waiting. I don't remember it all too well. I was 5 and my mind's been fuzzy on a lot of the details, but there are certain things that have stayed with me over the years. It was one of those days where you feel safe and carefree because you're with your family in the woods. I wasn't worried, didn't think twice about it. It was just another adventure. We had gone out to hike a familiar trail that led into some deeper, untamed woods. My dad, a few cousins, and some of the adults were with me. I remember the scent of pine in the air, the cool breeze, and the way the light flickered through the branches above, almost like a slow dance. I was always a curious kid, never one to stay close behind. I liked trailing off a little, wandering off the path when I could, seeing where my feet would take me. That day, I ended up behind a bit, walking with my cousin, just messing around and seeing who could step over fallen branches the quickest. The forest was dense, the trees standing tall and thick, and the ground was soft with moss and leaves that made little crunching noises when I stepped on them. I don't remember exactly why, but something about the woods that day felt different. The air felt heavier than normal, and there was a quietness that didn't quite sit right. It wasn't the usual sounds of birds or squirrels. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Eventually, we caught up to the others. They had stopped. I didn't think much of it at first, but there was something odd in the way they stood, frozen, like they were waiting for something. I remember the way my dad looked when I approached him. His face wasn't the warm, relaxed look it usually had. It was tight, and there was something in his eyes that I couldn't read. I got closer, trying to peer past my dad and the other adults, but they were all facing the same direction, blocking my view. I couldn't tell what they were looking at. I tried to move around them, to sneak a glimpse of whatever had caught their attention, but my dad reached out and turned me around before I could get any closer. At that moment, there was a strange feeling in my stomach. My curiosity, the kind that had always been my companion on these little adventures, turned into something else. A sense of unease crept in, and I couldn't shake it. I wanted to know what they were looking at. I wanted to understand why everything had suddenly gone quiet, why they seemed so still, like they were afraid to breathe. As we turned to walk back the way we came, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The image I saw in that split second never left me. It was a black shape, large and heavy, twisted in a way that didn't make sense to me at the time. It wasn't just a lump of shadow. It was an animal, but something was wrong with it. There was something unnatural about the way it lay there. My young mind couldn't process it completely, but the sight made my chest tighten, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was a bear, I learned later in life, but not just any bear. It was a black bear, or at least what had been a black bear. Its body was contorted in a way I still can't fully explain. There were flies buzzing around it, thick swarms that clouded the air, like they were drawn to something, but the smell was the worst part. It wasn't the typical smell of the forest, of earth and pine. It was something rotten, something decayed. I didn't ask any questions then. I didn't know how to voice the unease that was growing inside me. We kept walking, and the adults stayed unusually quiet, only the sound of our footsteps on the forest floor accompanying us. My dad, usually the one to crack a joke or tell a story, didn't say anything. He just led us back, quickening his pace until we reached the house, the familiar sight of the cabin offering some kind of comfort. I asked about it once we were inside, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of juice in front of me. I wanted to know what we'd seen, what had happened, but no one answered directly. They just kept saying they were tired and wanted to go home. They didn't explain. They didn't tell me why we had to leave so suddenly. They just brushed it off like it wasn't important. I couldn't stop thinking about it, though. I could still see that twisted figure in my mind, the flies buzzing around, the strange stillness of it. But I didn't know what I was looking at, not really. I didn't know then that it was the body of a dead bear, caught in a trap that had mangled its foot and left it in a grotesque, unnatural position. The adults didn't talk about it, but I could tell from the way they moved, from the looks they exchanged, that it had disturbed them. They didn't want to talk about what had happened, what we had seen. As I grew older, I learned more. A lot of the adults in our family started referring to that day as the bear story, like it was some kind of local legend, something to share around the campfire when we went back to those woods. They talked about the bear like it was a symbol of something, maybe nature's fury, maybe a warning. They never went back to that spot, not even on later camping trips. The story, however, lived on. It became one of those strange, half-whispered things you talk about when the night gets too quiet, the kind of tale that makes your skin crawl but doesn't have a neat ending. The bear, they said, had been mutilated, but not by nature. Something had caused it. They couldn't figure out what it was. Some people speculated it was the work of some other animal, maybe a predator, but the way the bear's body was arranged, the way it had been left, didn't fit any of those theories. The trap it had been caught in was old, rusted, even, but still deadly. Some said it had been abandoned, set without anyone knowing it, and the bear had wandered into it, struggling and thrashing until it couldn't fight anymore. Others thought it was something else, maybe a human, someone with a twisted purpose. But the adults didn't talk about it much after that. It became this unspoken thing. We'd go camping at the same spot, in those woods that used to feel like home, and no one ever mentioned the bear again. But it was there, in the back of my mind, even after all these years. A memory that stayed with me. Now, when I go camping, I can't help but feel the weight of those woods. I wonder if that bear still lingers there, in the quiet corners of the forest where the trees are thick, and the shadows are deeper than they should be. I wonder if the memory of what happened to it, whatever it was, still haunts that spot. The stories we tell around the fire, the old ghost stories of the bear in the woods, have become a part of my own memory too. But I don't need to imagine what it was. I know what I saw. I know it wasn't just a random death, a natural thing. It was wrong, something that shouldn't have happened. And no one wanted to talk about it because they knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the bear's death that made the woods feel so wrong. It was something about the way it happened, something about that twisted shape lying in the forest, that made everything feel like it was off balance. Years later, as an adult, I still remember that day, and I can't shake the feeling that there's something we all missed, something we never understood about that bear, about that moment. Maybe it's better we never talked about it. Maybe not knowing is what kept us safe. But I can't help but wonder if the woods are still hiding something that's better left untouched. Maybe it's just a memory now, but the fear it left, that's still there, and it's never really gone. When I was a little kid, I went to summer camp every year. It was the kind of place where you'd spend your days hiking, swimming, and doing crafts. And at night, you'd sit around the campfire telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. It was a place where kids could just be kids, and we felt free, like nothing bad could ever happen. We were surrounded by thick woods, deep enough to feel like they stretched on forever, and you could almost forget the world outside existed. One morning, my group of about 10 kids, all around 8 or 9 years old, was sent on a hike through the woods. We had our counselor, Ms. Taylor, leading us with her bright, energetic smile and constant chatter. She was young, maybe in her 20s, and full of energy. We were all excited, running ahead and playing little games along the way, trying to see who could spot the biggest tree or the coolest animal. It was a beautiful morning, with the sun shining through the trees and the air warm but not too hot. The smell of pine and fresh earth hung in the air, and the woods felt peaceful, the only sounds being the birds singing and the crunch of our shoes on the trail. We walked for about half an hour, following a narrow, winding path that led deeper into the forest. We'd passed the usual landmarks. The old oak tree where we had lunch the year before, the creek we splashed in on a hot day, but this time we were heading to a new spot for our nature lesson. That's when we saw it. First, it didn't even look like anything was wrong. There was a dog just standing there in the middle of the trail. It was a big, friendly-looking dog with a shaggy coat of brown and white fur, kind of like a mix between a retriever and a border collie. It had its tail wagging happily, and it was looking at us, as if it was waiting to be pet. I remember thinking, how cute, and a few of the other kids started to move closer, eager to pet it. But something didn't sit right with me. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but there was something odd about the way it was standing. It didn't seem like it was moving the way a dog should. It was almost too still. Then I saw it. The dog's head, more specifically, the huge chunk of its head that was missing. The fur around its skull was matted and dark with dried blood, and the skin on its head had been pulled back, like someone had peeled it away, exposing the muscle and part of the skull underneath. The left side of its head was practically gone. It was like a large portion of its brain had been scraped off, leaving a raw, gory mess. But the dog was still standing there, wagging its tail, its mouth open in what looked like a goofy smile. My heart dropped into my stomach. The dog should have been dead, or at least in pain, but it wasn't acting like anything was wrong. It was like it was just there. I could hear a few of the other kids start to giggle, thinking it was some weird, maybe funny prank. But I didn't laugh. I just stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Miss Taylor's voice broke through the momentary silence. "All right, kids, step back," she said sharply. "Step back now." Her voice didn't sound cheerful anymore. She wasn't smiling. She moved toward us quickly, her eyes locked on the dog, her face serious. I could see a mix of confusion and worry in her eyes. "Stay away from it," she said firmly. But I didn't understand. It wasn't like the dog had attacked anyone or shown any signs of being dangerous. It just stood there, as if everything was fine. I looked at the dog again, trying to figure out if it was really as bad as it seemed. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or a weird injury. something that wasn't as bad as it looked. But then the dog stepped forward. It didn't seem to have any trouble walking, even though its head was in such a bad state. It moved towards us, tail wagging faster now, its eyes still bright, looking at us like it wanted to play. That's when I realized that it wasn't right. The way it moved, the way it acted, it was too normal. The blood on its head, the damage, none of it made sense. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong with that dog, and I wasn't sure what. I had a sudden feeling, deep in my gut, that this wasn't just a stray dog that had gotten hurt. There was something else going on here. Miss Taylor quickly ushered us all back a few steps, her tone now full of urgency. "All right, everyone, get behind me. Stay back, please." We didn't argue. Everyone instinctively knew to move away from the dog. The dog didn't seem to care, though. It just kept walking toward us, its steps slow and steady, as if it hadn't noticed anything odd about its condition. Its tongue hung out of its mouth, and it was still wagging its tail like it was the happiest dog in the world. Miss Taylor immediately pulled out her walkie-talkie, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke into it. "This is Miss Taylor. We found a dog on the trail, and it's in bad shape. It's still alive, but it's hurt badly. We need someone to come and get it." She looked at us, her face pale. "Stay back," she repeated, her voice almost a whisper now. "Do not go near that dog." The mood of the whole group shifted. The playfulness disappeared, and everyone started looking at each other nervously. A couple of the kids started to cry, and Miss Taylor comforted them with soft words. But my mind was racing. What had happened to that dog? How had it gotten so badly hurt, and why was it acting like nothing was wrong? I stayed where I was, my eyes glued to the dog. Couldn't look away. Even though Miss Taylor had asked us not to go near it, I couldn't help but feel this strange pull to the animal. Something about its calm, almost cheerful demeanor was unsettling, but I didn't know why. Within minutes, a couple of other camp counselors appeared, walking down the trail toward us. One of them had a first aid kit and a leash in his hand. The other had a phone pressed to his ear, speaking to someone on the other end. They knelt beside the dog, speaking softly to it, trying to coax it into letting them get close. I watched as the man with the first aid kit carefully examined the dog's injury, his face grim. He didn't say anything, but I could tell from his expression that it was worse than any of us had realized. He looked up at Miss Taylor. "This dog is in bad shape," he said quietly. "We need to get it to the vet as soon as possible." "Is it going to make it?" Miss Taylor asked, her voice tight. The man shook his head. "I don't know, but we'll try." The two counselors carefully put the dog on a leash and guided it away from us. It didn't resist. It didn't try to run or show any sign of aggression. It just followed them like a good dog, still wagging its tail, still looking at them with those happy, trusting eyes. We watched as they led the dog down the trail, disappearing into the woods. The whole group was silent as we made our way back to camp. No one was joking around anymore. We were all too shaken by what we had seen. I couldn't stop thinking about that dog and how it had acted so normal despite the damage to its head. It didn't make sense. Later that day, we found out that the dog belonged to a family who lived on the campgrounds. They were the caretakers responsible for taking care of the property and the animals. Apparently, the dog had gotten into a fight with some wild animal, maybe a coyote or another dog, and had been severely injured. The family had been looking for it for days, but they hadn't found it until now. The dog was rushed to a local vet, but by the time it got there, it was too late. The injury had been too severe, and the dog didn't survive. I didn't feel relieved when I heard that. I didn't feel anything good. I just felt this deep, unsettled feeling in my chest. The dog, no matter how injured, had kept acting like everything was okay, like nothing was wrong. It had acted like it was still happy, still wanted to be with us. And that thought that something could be so wrong yet appear so right stayed with me for a long time after that summer. I don't know what really happened to that dog or why it acted the way it did. I don't know if it was just confused or if it had somehow survived too long after the injury. But I do know that sometimes things aren't as simple as they seem. And sometimes, no matter how cheerful or friendly something looks, There's something darker beneath the surface, something that doesn't show until it's too late. And that's what I remember most about that summer camp. Not the fun activities or the campfire stories, not the games or the friends. I remember that dog, the one that came out of the woods with a chunk of its head missing, acting like it was still just another happy dog, ready to greet us. I've always loved the outdoors, the stillness of the woods, and the quiet hum of nature. So, when a group of friends and I decided to hike up the mountain to catch the sunrise, it felt like the perfect adventure. We planned to leave in the middle of the night so we could make it to the top in time to see the sun break over the horizon. It wasn't the first time we'd hiked at night, but this time something felt different. We began our hike around 2 a.m. The sky was a thick black velvet, with only the faintest twinkling of stars overhead. Our headlamps lit up the trail just enough to avoid stumbling over roots and rocks, but the surrounding woods were so dark that the trees felt like looming shadows. The air was crisp, with the chill of the night settling deep into our bones. Each step we took seemed to echo, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the sound of things moving in the distance. I remember feeling a bit uneasy at first. Hiking at night has its way of playing tricks on you. Every rustle of leaves made me wonder if an animal was nearby, watching us. But it was mostly the quiet that bothered me. There was something unnatural about it. It wasn't like the usual nighttime sounds you expect from a forest, like insects or the occasional owl. It was dead silent. As we hiked, our breath visible in the cold night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods, though beautiful, seemed to grow more ominous with each passing minute. After about an hour of hiking, we reached a point where the trail split. There was a faint path that veered off to the right, but none of us were familiar with it. We'd planned to stick to the main trail, but that's when I saw them. A group of people standing in the middle of the path. They were just standing there in a tight circle, looking like they were waiting for something. My first instinct was to turn back, but my curiosity got the best of me. I motioned to my friends to keep going, and I crept off the trail to see what they were doing. As I got closer, I realized they were arranged in a perfect circle around one person who was lying on the ground. They didn't notice me approaching, and I stood there in the dark, watching them for a moment. There was something about the scene that didn't sit right with me. The way they were standing so still, so methodical, it didn't feel natural. I thought maybe they were hikers like us, just taking a break or maybe setting up camp. But as I watched them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The way they stood there in complete silence, unmoving, it was as if they were waiting for something. Finally, one of them, the man who seemed to be leading, looked up and I quickly stepped forward, trying to mask my unease. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound casual. "I'm just trying to find my way to the top. I need to take the fastest route. Can you point me in the right direction?" The man stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he pointed off to the left, away from the path I was on. "No," he said in a voice that was almost too calm, too deliberate. "That way is a dead end. Go that way," he said, gesturing farther up the trail. I didn't question him. I was eager to keep going and didn't want to make things awkward. It was the middle of the night, and who knows? Maybe he knew something about the trail that I didn't. I turned to head in the direction he pointed, grateful for the guidance, even though something in the back of my mind told me to be cautious. The group remained silent as I walked away, and I felt their eyes on me as I went. I glanced back briefly but quickly averted my gaze when I realized they hadn't moved an inch. It was unsettling. I rejoined my group, telling them about the strangers I'd seen. Everyone was a little on edge, but we kept moving forward. We hiked for another 15 minutes, the trail becoming steeper and the trees closing in around us. The forest felt even darker now, and I could hear my friends' voices echoing off the trees, but it was almost as if the woods were swallowing them up. We were deep into the mountain now, and everything felt quiet, too quiet. Soon, the trail began to narrow, and I could feel the ground becoming rougher beneath my feet. The rocks were slick with dew, and the trees were so thick that they seemed to press in on us. My breath was coming in short bursts, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. We rounded a corner, and that's when I saw it. A huge pile of fallen trees. The path was blocked completely. I stood there for a moment, staring at it in confusion. This wasn't what I had expected. The trail was supposed to keep going. There was no way this was a dead end, not unless someone had deliberately blocked it. I turned to my friends, and we all began to look around, trying to figure out what to do next. The trees were massive, too large to climb over easily. I tried to squeeze through the gaps between the trunks, pushing branches out of the way, but the more I tried, the more hopeless it felt. That's when I heard it, a loud, gut-wrenching scream, long and piercing. It seemed to echo through the trees, bouncing off the rocks and trees, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My mind was frozen in shock. The scream was so raw, so full of pain, that it sent chills down my spine. The scream lasted for what felt like an eternity, but it didn't stop. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the woods went completely silent. The silence was deafening. It was like someone had turned off all the noise in the world. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around at my friends. No one spoke. No one moved. I don't know how much time passed, but it felt like forever. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The scream was so human, so desperate. It couldn't have come from an animal. But who was out here, screaming like that, in the middle of the night? We all stood there in the dead silence, looking at each other. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Something was very wrong. But there was no turning back now. We couldn't go back the way we came. There was no time for that. We had to keep going. And so, with heavy hearts and uneasy steps, we pushed forward. We finally made it to the top of the mountain, but I couldn't shake the image of the people I had seen earlier, standing there in a circle, and the scream that had echoed through the woods. I thought about turning around, going back down to look for them, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't be there. They never had been. When we passed the spot where I had seen the group, it was empty. The circle in the woods was gone. There was no sign of the man who had pointed me in the right direction, no sign of anyone at all. It was as if they had never been there. I've thought about that night over and over since then. The scream, the people, the stillness of the woods. It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. I don't know what we encountered that night, but it wasn't just hikers. There was something else out there, something that we weren't meant to find. To this day, I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was a warning, or if we were just lucky to get out. But one thing is certain. I'll never forget that scream, or the look on the man's face when he pointed us in the wrong direction. Sometimes I think about going back to the mountain to see if I can find the truth, but deep down, I know some things are better left alone. The woods have a way of hiding their secrets, and some things once seen can never be unseen. I remember that day like it was yesterday, though I wish I could forget. It was a cool, crisp autumn afternoon when I first stumbled across it, or rather, when my friend found it. We had decided to take a hike up the old trail that wound through the woods behind our childhood homes. The trail was one we'd hiked countless times, the kind of path where we knew every tree, rock, and bend like the back of our hands. We were used to the solitude of it, the peace that came from being surrounded by nature, so we didn't expect anything unusual, especially not what we ended up finding. The trail was quiet, as it usually was, save for the crunching of dry leaves beneath our boots and the occasional bird call. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out forever. The forest was dense here, the trees growing so thick that in some places, the sky was barely visible through the canopy. We were a good few miles out from the nearest road when my friend, Dave, had to step off the trail to pee. "Be right back," he called over his shoulder, stepping into the brush. I kept walking, not thinking much of it. The only thing on my mind was the steep incline ahead. But then, I heard him shout, a sound of genuine surprise, maybe even a little alarm in his voice. "Hey, you've got to see this." I turned, a little confused, and walked back toward the edge of the trail where Dave had wandered off. When I rounded the corner, I didn't see him right away. What I did see, however, was something that immediately made my heart skip a beat. There, partially hidden behind a cluster of thick trees, was the front half of a car. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd seen wrecks in the woods before, old, rusted cars left abandoned after accidents. But this was something different. I walked up to it cautiously, feeling an odd sense of unease, as if I was about to cross some invisible line. The car was unmistakably from the 1960s, one of those classic models with the rounded edges and chrome bumpers that glinted dully in the low sunlight. But that wasn't what made it strange. What made it strange was that it was just the front half. There was no back seat, no trunk, nothing. The rear end of the car had been smashed and seemingly removed, as if it had been crushed by some massive force, or worse, had been taken away entirely. The whole thing looked like it had been sliced in half cleanly, leaving only the engine block, the driver's seat, and the passenger's seat intact. The wheels still sat under the front end, half sunk into the dirt, with a few weeds poking up between the spokes. The windows were cracked, the glass shattered and scattered around like confetti. The paint was faded, almost completely gone in some spots, revealing patches of rusty metal beneath. Whoever had placed this car here, or whatever had happened to it, had done so a long time ago. And yet, there it was, sitting like some weird artifact from the past, a ghost of a time long gone. Dave was standing beside it, his face pale, staring at it in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath. "This isn't just some abandoned car." I didn't know what to say. The more I looked at it, the weirder it seemed. There was no way anyone could have driven this car here. Not through this thick forest, not to this spot. There was no road, no clearing, no way for a car to have possibly been brought here. The only explanation I could think of was that it had somehow been dropped from the sky. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? My mind raced, trying to come up with any sort of logical explanation. Maybe it was part of some kind of art installation? But that didn't make any sense either. Who would do something like this just to leave half a car in the woods for no reason? And why just the front half? I crouched down to get a closer look at the engine, half expecting it to be completely rusted out, but to my surprise, it still looked relatively intact. The engine block was covered in grime, but it wasn't nearly as rusted as I would have expected for something that had been left out in the woods for God knows how long. There were some odd markings on the engine, 2 scrapes and gouges in the metal that looked almost deliberate. I reached out to touch it, but Dave quickly stopped me. "Don't," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We don't know what the hell this is. Don't touch anything." I stood up, feeling a little foolish for thinking of even trying to touch something that clearly didn't belong there. But I was still so confused, trying to piece it all together in my mind. I turned to Dave, wanting to say something, but no words came. We were both silent for a long moment, just staring at the wreck. "Who would do this?" I finally asked. "I don't know," Dave replied, shaking his head. "But whoever they were, they sure didn't want anyone finding it." The more we looked at it, the more it felt like there was something off about the whole situation. The car didn't belong there. It didn't make any sense. And yet, there it was, staring back at us, like a strange riddle that we couldn't solve. It was then that we realized something else. There was no sign of any recent human activity around the car. No tire tracks in the dirt, no footprints around it, no signs of anyone having been there for a long time. The trees were thick, the underbrush untended, and everything felt untouched. It was like the car had just been dropped there, frozen in time. We took one last look at it before we made the decision to leave. Neither of us said much as we walked back to the trail, the weird feeling still hanging in the air like a fog. We talked about it briefly on the way back, but neither of us had any answers, and neither of us felt much like pushing the subject any further. As we left the woods and returned to the familiarity of our neighborhood, the car lingered in my mind. I tried to shake it off, but the more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that we hadn't just stumbled across an abandoned relic from the past. There was something deliberate about it, something planned. Whoever had put that car there had done so with a reason. But what that reason was, we would never know. The strangest part was that, As far as we could tell, no one had ever reported the car. No one seemed to know it was there, and no one had ever found it before us, despite the trail being a popular hiking spot for years. That car had been sitting there, hidden in the woods, for who knows how long, and it made me realize just how many secrets the forest was keeping. I never went back to that spot again. I don't know why. I suppose I didn't want to know more about the car, didn't want to find anything else that might push the mystery into something even darker. But something about it stayed with me, that feeling of unease, that question of why it was there, why only half of it, and why it had been left alone for so long. Maybe one day someone else will stumble across it, and maybe they'll figure out what happened. But I doubt it. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, buried in the woods where no one can reach them. The front half of a car, hidden away like a piece of a puzzle no one will ever complete. And in a way, maybe that's better, because some things are better left untouched. I'm sure there's some explanation for what I saw, but to this day, I can't get my head around it. It was a few years ago, just before winter properly set in here in the UK. It's that time of year when the days get shorter and the evenings come crashing in too soon, making you feel like the dark has a way of creeping up on you faster than you can adjust. It was already getting darker by about 5 p.m. when I decided to take my dog for a walk, just like I usually did. The air was cold, and the ground was soft and muddy from the rain earlier in the day. My dog, a scruffy terrier with more energy than sense, was running ahead, darting here and there as we headed down our usual route, a muddy track behind a row of houses. The path wasn't anything special, really, just a narrow stretch of land that ran along a chain-link fence separating the houses from a small patch of woodland. You could hear the rustling of the trees as the wind pushed through the branches, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the faint noise of passing traffic from the nearby road. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was a quiet, peaceful area, the kind of place you'd normally feel safe in, at least during the day. In the evening, though, it started to get a little more unsettling, with the sun dipping lower in the sky and the woods slowly becoming darker and more mysterious. The track wasn't particularly popular. Not many people used it except for the occasional dog walker or a few locals cutting through. It was secluded enough to feel like it was your own private space, which I suppose is part of the reason I liked it. It wasn't an overly long walk either, just enough to get some fresh air and let my dog burn off some energy. I'd walked that path countless times, and I always stuck to the same route. There was a certain comfort in that, in knowing where everything was and having the predictability of it all. But on that evening, things weren't the same. Something about the air felt heavy, like there was something off. I wasn't overly worried at first. I'd walked through these woods for years, and aside from a few odd encounters here and there, nothing had ever made me feel truly uneasy. But as I walked along that narrow track, the trees on one side of me and the chain-link fence on the other, I began to notice something strange in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. It was getting darker, after all. But as I got closer, I could see clearly enough to know something wasn't right. There, hanging from the branches of one of the trees, was what looked like the remains of an animal. I stopped in my tracks, my dog already pulling ahead, too excited to notice. My stomach twisted as I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It looked like a skinned goat. That was the only way I could describe it at first. A disemboweled, gutted creature, the skin hanging loosely from the branches, strips of fur still clinging to the bones. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just that. No, it was the hooves. They were clearly visible, suspended in the air, like they'd been intentionally placed there, almost as if to mock nature. The bones looked wrong, like they had been carefully stripped down and left to dangle like some grotesque trophy. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, and then I noticed something else. On the ground, just beneath the branches where the goat had been hung, there was a large sack-like object, white in color, but with a sickly pink and green hue to it. It was bulging, swollen with something, and it was leaking a strange, viscous liquid. The sack was too big, too abnormal. It looked almost like it was pulsating, like whatever was inside it was alive. My first thought was that it was some kind of sick joke, some sort of prank, perhaps, but it didn't feel like a joke. It felt Real. Too real. And that's when panic set in. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively stepped back, holding the leash tighter as my dog tugged at it, oblivious to the danger. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew that I needed to leave. I had no idea who or what could have done this, but the thought of something capable of this kind of savagery made my blood run cold. I didn't know what kind of monster could do something like that. I didn't even want to imagine it. But as I turned to leave, I felt a chill run down my spine, something that told me I wasn't alone. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I had to keep my eyes on that grotesque sight, like some invisible force was pulling me back to it, forcing me to acknowledge what was happening. The idea of something lurking in those woods, something capable of such cruelty, filled me with a dread that was almost too much to bear. I didn't have my phone with me. I always regretted not taking it that night. If I had, I could have taken a picture, shown someone, gotten proof of what I'd seen. But I didn't. All I had was the image burned into my mind. The skinned goat, the swollen sack, the strange liquid oozing from it. It was like something out of a horror movie, but it was real, and it was happening right there, just on the other side of that chain link fence. I didn't stop to think. I turned and walked as fast as I could, keeping my head down and my dog by my side. I felt a panic rising in me, the kind you get when you know something terrible is behind you, just out of sight, but you don't dare look back. I didn't know what was following me, if anything was, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, pressed down on me like a weight. I didn't look back until I reached the safety of the houses at the end of the track, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lurking just out of view. My heart was racing, my legs shaky. I let my dog lead me back toward home, barely registering the walk, my mind too preoccupied with what I had seen. I didn't breathe easily until I was inside my house, locking the door behind me. That was the last time I ever walked down that track. I couldn't bring myself to do it again, not after what I'd seen. And yet, the image of it, the feeling of it, has never left me. Every time I pass that area now, even in the daylight, I can't shake the sense that something's wrong. Like there's something hidden just behind the trees, something waiting. It's a part of me now, that fear, follows me. I've told a few people about what I saw, but no one believes me. They tell me it was probably some animal carcass left by a farmer, or maybe even a prank, though I can't imagine anyone going to the trouble of doing something like that. But the more I think about it, the less I believe any of those explanations. What I saw was too strange, too unnatural. That sack, bulging with whatever it was, the sickly color, the way it looked so wrong. And the hooves still haunt me. The truth is, I don't know what it was. I don't know who or what could have done something like that. But I'm certain it wasn't a natural thing. And I'm certain it wasn't a joke. I don't know what lurks in those woods, but I don't want to find out. Some things, I think, are better left unexplored. And so, I've never walked that track again. I haven't even gotten close. Every time I pass by that area, I feel a shiver run down my spine, as if whatever was out there is still waiting, watching, just out of sight. Whatever it was, I don't think it was human. And I'm okay with never knowing what kind of monster could do something like that. Some things are better left unknown. I wish I had taken a picture, but then again, I wonder if seeing it again would make it all feel real in a way that might drive me mad. For now, I'll keep my distance and I'll never walk that path again. And I'll keep my dog close, always. Some things in the woods aren't meant to be understood. Some things should stay in the dark, just where they belong. Back in my hometown, there used to be a huge mental hospital. It was an imposing building, set on a hill just a few miles from my parents' house. I don't remember much about it when I was a kid, mostly because it was closed down by the time I was old enough to understand what it was. I never really asked about it, though I do remember hearing a lot of rumors, things about how patients were treated or stories about it being haunted. Eventually, the hospital was torn down and the land was repurposed. They built houses and apartments there, one of which my friend Scott's family moved into when we were about 8 or 9. Scott and I were inseparable growing up, always getting into trouble, especially when it came to exploring. Every weekend, we'd go on what we called adventures. Sometimes we'd ride our bikes along the old railway tracks, or we'd wander the forests behind our school, imagining we were treasure hunters or secret agents on a mission. But there was one place that always intrigued us more than anything: the woods behind the old mental hospital. It had been years since the place was closed down, but the buildings still loomed in the background, their crumbling structures barely visible through the trees. Even though most of the grounds were turned into housing, the woods that stretched behind it had remained untouched. They felt different somehow, darker, more isolated. It wasn't the kind of place you'd want to wander alone, especially not as a kid. One day, Scott and I decided we'd go deeper into those woods. We'd seen them plenty of times from the edge, but neither of us had dared to go too far in. The trees were thick, and it seemed like they stretched on forever. We grabbed our backpacks, filled them with snacks, and set out like we were going on the grandest adventure of our young lives. The first thing we noticed was the quiet. It wasn't the kind of peaceful silence you might expect, but an eerie, heavy kind of quiet. No birds singing, no rustling leaves in the wind, just an unsettling stillness that made us both feel uneasy. The further we went, the more the air seemed to thicken. I remember the smell, too. A mix of damp earth and something else, something sharp and metallic. We tried to ignore it as we were kids, and kids don't like admitting they're scared. But there was something about the place that made us both nervous, something we couldn't put our fingers on. After walking for what felt like hours, we stumbled across something unexpected. A small clearing, overgrown with weeds and trees so old, they looked like they had been there for centuries. In the middle of this clearing, half hidden by the wild vegetation, were a series of old, weathered tombstones. The cemetery was small but had an ancient, decayed air about it. The stones were cracked, covered in moss, and leaning at odd angles, as if they had been abandoned for decades. We stood there in silence for a moment, our hearts pounding in our chests. As a kid, it felt like we had just discovered some long-lost, forbidden place. But the more we looked around, the more uncomfortable we became. The graves were clearly old, but some of them had dates that went back well over 100 years. One of them, though, stood out, an enormous stone with a name barely legible from the erosion. We could make out a few letters, but nothing that really told us who was buried there. Still, we felt like we shouldn't have been there. Scott was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "We should go." I agreed without hesitation, and we turned to leave, but something in the air had changed. The woods felt even more oppressive now, and the path back seemed to stretch farther than it had when we first entered. We weren't in any real danger. I knew that, but something about that graveyard had unsettled us deeply. It felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there, like we had uncovered something we weren't meant to see. We managed to find our way back to the edge of the woods and didn't speak about it for the rest of the day. But neither of us could shake the feeling that we had discovered something that had been hidden for a reason. The strange unease stayed with me long after I left Scott's house and went home. I didn't tell my parents, and Scott didn't tell his. We both just kept the experience to ourselves. Years passed. Scott and I grew up, and life took us in different directions. I didn't think about that graveyard much anymore, but it was always in the back of my mind. The old mental hospital had long been turned into new homes, and the woods had been cleared for more development. But the graveyard remained, at least in my memory. Then, one day when I was in my late teens, I came across an article while browsing the internet. It was a story about a man who had been a prime suspect in the infamous Jack the Ripper case. The article mentioned that, despite his connection to the murders in London, the man had never been convicted, and his body had been buried in an obscure cemetery in a small town in the United States. It took me a moment to realize that the cemetery they were talking about was the very one Scott and I had discovered all those years ago. It was a chilling realization. The name on the stone I had been unable to read all those years ago, it was his. The man they suspected of being Jack the Ripper was buried in that very cemetery. I couldn't believe it at first. It seemed impossible that a notorious figure from history could be connected to a small, forgotten graveyard in the woods behind a housing development. But as I read more, the details lined up. The dates matched, the name was unmistakable, and there was even mention of his body being unmarked for years, perhaps deliberately to keep his identity hidden. The more I dug, the more unsettling it became. The graveyard that had frightened us as children, the one we had left behind without ever fully understanding its significance, was the final resting place of someone who might have been the most infamous murderer in history. The thought of that dark secret lying just beneath the surface of our hometown disturbed me deeply. I'd spent my entire life walking past that area, living right next to it, without ever knowing the true history of the place. It felt like the past was watching me, lingering just out of reach, and there was nothing I could do to change it. I went back to the cemetery, alone this time, just to see if I could make sense of what had happened all those years ago. The houses had all been built up, and the land had been completely transformed, but the cemetery was still there, hidden in the woods, as it always had been. The stones were more worn now, and some had fallen over completely, but there it was, one grave among them that looked like it had been recently disturbed. The ground around it was dug up, and the stone, though still weathered, seemed to have been newly set in place. I stood there for a long time, staring at the grave. The wind was still, the air thick and heavy, and the silence in the woods felt even more oppressive than before. The truth of what had been buried here, both literally and figuratively, seemed to settle on me. The man who had died here had been a suspect in some of the most brutal murders in history. The graveyard wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten, on purpose, perhaps. And now, all these years later, I was standing at the edge of something that had never truly been left behind. I left the cemetery that day, not feeling scared in the way I had as a child, but unsettled. The weight of history, of what had happened, lingered in the air. I never spoke to Scott about it again, and I never told anyone else about what I had discovered. Some things I realized are better left buried in the past. That cemetery in the woods, the one we thought was just an old, forgotten graveyard, held more than just the remains of those who had passed away. It held secrets. Secrets that had been carefully hidden, not just from the world, but from those who had lived right next to it, growing up in its shadow without ever knowing the truth.